listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. I want to explore a recurring historical and cultural pattern that's always bugged me as a music teacher. That's musicians who were rejected that later proved to be foundational. Drawing on examples from artists such as the Beatles, Billie Holiday, Bob Dylan, Radiohead, and many others, I want to unpack the reality that hidden musical talent often goes unrecognized by institutional structures, whether it's academic, commercial, or cultural, until some kind of catalytic moment comes along to ignite it. I want to challenge the traditional metrics of musical aptitude and emphasize the importance of nonconformity, context, and crucial timing in artistic development. Now, before I get wound up here, I want to dispel the widely accepted proposition that if you simply want something bad enough and you put your mind to it, any dream can come true. That's preposterous and totally unrealistic. I hear musicians say that nonsense all the time at every award show, and it's just not true. Sometimes people want to do something really, really badly, but unfortunately they really, really suck at it. All the wishing and dreaming in the world is not going to fabricate talent that's not there and magically start opening doors. I once heard Carl Sagan explain an analogy where, people once laughed at Albert Einstein and they once laughed at Sir Isaac Newton. And Sagan pointed out that, they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. Getting laughed at is not an indication of genius, and getting rejected is not an indication of talent. Sometimes people get rejected because they're not any good. However, throughout the 20th century, some of the most transformative figures in music were initially dismissed as unremarkable, unskilled, or commercially unviable. From high school teachers and glee clubs to record executives and critics, the institutions tasked with evaluating talent have frequently failed to recognize the potential of blooming artists who would later reshape entire genres. These stories of rejection and eventual vindication form a pattern that invites deeper analysis. My purpose is not merely to just retell these worn-out anecdotes, but to consider why these failures happened and what they revealed about how we define, measure, and ultimately recognize talent. Now, what connects these cases is a single unifying idea that talent often hides beneath the surface and goes unrecognized until some kind of catalyst sparks it into life. Sometimes talent's there, but hides where even the most trained eyes won't catch it. Latent genius does not announce itself with credentials. Sometimes it whispers in basements, it stutters on demo tapes. It's easily missed by trained professionals who are mostly seeking polish and perfection. Now, for these artists, their talent was neither openly nor institutionally legible. Their artistry was too raw. It was too unorthodox or simply too early. It's only in retrospect that their innovations appear obvious. They were not artists born into genius. They had to fight to be heard, first against gatekeepers and then later against genre conventions that they themselves helped to dismantle. First up, Paul McCartney and George Harrison. There was a music teacher in Liverpool in the 1950s who had half the Beatles in his class, and he missed it. Both Paul McCartney and George Harrison were told by their high school music teacher, Alan Durband, that they lacked musical talent. Mr. Durband was not incompetent, nor malicious. He simply assessed them according to the pedagogical values of his time. Did they take formal lessons? Well, no. Could they read music? No. Could they perform music within a classical framework? Well, absolutely no. What he failed to see was a different kind of musical intelligence, one that was rooted in intuitive composition, collaborative improvisation, and cultural instincts. To judge Paul and George by the standards of their schoolmasters was like judging a painter by how well they color inside the lines. Now, the Beatles, of course, would go on to pioneer studio techniques, songwriting structures, and cultural narratives that defined the 20th century. In the opinions of many music historians, the Beatles were the most significant composers of the 20th century, period. They successfully merged pop music with art music, thereby saving art music from the brink of cultural suicide. And there were no metrics available anywhere in the 1950s to spot that. I'm not sure anybody in the world could have recognized their immense potential. Their example underscores how rigid evaluative criteria can obscure non-traditional forms of genius. The gap between academic training and instinctive creativity remains a challenge in music education even to this day. And next up, Elvis Presley. In 1947, a young Elvis Presley auditioned for his high school glee club in Tupelo, Mississippi, and he was turned away. The rejection didn't stem from an absence of ability, but from a mismatch in style. Presley's voice, which was rooted in gospel, blues, and hillbilly music, was seen as too raw, too informal. He lacked the polish that was expected in an institutional choral ensemble. But that voice, untrained and unrefined as it was, sparked a global revolution. Elvis wasn't polished. He was authentic. And that authenticity, not refinement, became the cornerstone of rock and roll. The institutional failure here lay in a preference for perfection over originality, formal control over emotional truth. Elvis didn't sound like anyone else because he wasn't trying to. He was channeling a much deeper current, one the glee club simply wasn't tuned to hear. Now, this early dismissal speaks to a broader institutional discomfort with informality and cross-genre synthesis. Bands and choirs prefer you to stay in your lane, and Elvis was all over the road. Presley's subsequent recordings at Sun Records revealed a voice that resonated across demographic lines. His rejection, in retrospect, was not a misstep, but an indicator that the evaluative framework itself was just too narrow. They couldn't see the forest for the trees. Presley's impact was not diminished by that early failure. In fact, it was catalyzed by it. Willie Nelson. Now, Willie Nelson's career was defined by rejection. He spent the early part of his career as a songwriter in Nashville, composing classic songs like Crazy for Patsy Cline. Yet, as a performer, he was met with intense skepticism. There wasn't any part of Willie Nelson that fit the Nashville mold. Record executives found his phrasing unusual and his voice unmarketable. He was told to sing differently, to clean up his act, to conform. But conformity was never Willie Nelson's strong suit. Rather than assimilate, he just left Nashville completely and returned to Texas. Now there, free from the industry's constraints, he helped pioneer the outlaw country movement, a raw, stripped-down alternative to commercial country music. Only after distancing himself from Nashville's commercial apparatus did he find the freedom to develop his idiosyncratic songwriting and the trademark sound that secured his legacy. He didn't adjust to the mold. He burned it down and built a new one. Now, ironically, his vocal phrasing, which was once called amateurish, is now studied for its subtlety and swing. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday's early career was marked by resistance from club owners and record executives who saw her as vocally limited. She didn't belt out her songs. She murmured. She bent the melody. She lingered behind the beat. Her voice did not possess the operatic range favored at the time. Instead, she offered something different, a capacity to reshape melody, inject emotional narrative into every phrase, and destabilize rhythmic expectations. Those very traits allowed her to redefine vocal jazz entirely, turning every song she sang into an emotionally charged narrative. Billie Holiday was not just a singer, she was a storyteller of ache, of longing, and defiance. Her story highlights the institutional inability to measure interpretive nuance and emotive complexity. She turned vulnerability into high voltage, and you simply can't measure those things. You can't teach them either. Her legacy forces us to reconsider how we evaluate vocal talent. Is range more important than resonance? Is power more valuable than subtlety? Is accuracy more aesthetic than emotion? Billie Holiday's successful career and enduring popularity answers all of those questions. You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Tom Daniel Show, and many, many thanks to Mary Mac, the world's most perfect band. Now, we've been talking about dismissed talent, and next up is good old Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was already famous and iconic to a generation when he changed everything and went electric. At the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, Bob Dylan took the stage with an electric guitar and was promptly booed by the audience and the entire folk community that had once embraced him. To them, he had abandoned the acoustic purity and political earnestness of folk music and sold out. What the audience failed to recognize was that Bob Dylan's shift to electric was an expansion, not a rejection. He wasn't betraying folk music, he was transforming it. He was pushing the boundaries of the genre, incorporating surrealism, stream of consciousness lyrics, and sonic complexity. To Bob Dylan, genius was never static. It was always in motion, dissonant, and full of refusal. The backlash he faced is indicative of how even the most progressive of communities can become stagnant, protecting traditions at the expense of evolution. John Lennon once told a story about the innovative counterculture club in Manhattan at a place called Max's Kansas City, where all the avant-garde artists of the 60s gathered. Now, at one point, club owner Mickey Ruskin decided to repaint the interior of the club. That's all, just repaint the interior. And all of the progressive artists had hissy fits about it. They didn't want to change. They based their whole career on change, but they wanted the club to stay just the way it was, same and familiar. And that's the exact same thing that Bob Dylan went through. Bob Dylan's career vindicated his decision. The very set that was booed became foundational for rock and roll lyricism, and his career has been a long argument against anything being put in a box. Every reinvention of his has made him harder to define and harder to dismiss. Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell's early work was often marginalized for being too intellectual or too personal. Critics and record labels struggled with her complex chord structures and her elusive melodies. Her confessional lyrics, rich with metaphor and emotional complexity, defied pop songwriting conventions. Record executives worried that her music just wasn't going to sell. Furthermore, as a female artist in the 1960s, she was subjected to reductive characterizations that framed emotional depth as being something that was unstable rather than insight. But Joni Mitchell wasn't interested in selling easy emotions. She wrote with an architect's precision and a confessor's vulnerability. Her album, Blue, is now widely regarded as one of the greatest albums of all time. It exemplifies how personal narrative can attain universal resonance when expressed with honesty and sophistication. Her later acclaim illustrates how time and cultural shifts can recontextualize an artist's value, especially one who challenged gender norms in both content and craft. Joni Mitchell's compositions weren't just songs. They were emotional blueprints. Her initial rejection was rooted in both aesthetic bias and gendered assumptions, a reminder that the very institutions we trust to think outside the box often uphold narrow visions of artistic value. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin signed with Columbia Records in her late teens, where she was initially miscast as a jazz pop standard singer. Those songs failed to harness her vocal power or her gospel foundation. The commercial response to those early Columbia albums was tepid. It was only after leaving Columbia and moving to Atlantic Records where she was allowed to play piano and record material aligned with her gospel roots. That's when Franklin really found her voice. Respect, Think, Natural Woman, they weren't just hits. They were declarations of identity. It wasn't the artist that changed. It was the framework around her. When she was finally heard in her own language, with her own musical grammar, she became the queen of soul. Recognition in her case was a matter of alignment, not transformation. This reinforces the idea that popularity often depends less on the artist and more on the environment in which they're allowed to work. Radiohead. Now, Radiohead's 1992 hit song Creep earned them initial fame, but also typecast them as a grunge-adjacent one-hit wonder. The press labeled them as derivative and doomed. Critics and audiences expected little more, but instead of just chasing after another hit, the band retreated and reinvented themselves. Radiohead responded with The Bends, followed by the landmark OK Computer, and the avant-garde Kid A. These albums revealed a band more interested in sonic architecture than commercial repetition. Radiohead's trajectory illustrates the danger of early critical narratives. Now, rather than conform to expectations, they deconstructed them. In doing so, they demonstrated that creative freedom often arises from disillusionment. Their rejection was not just overcome, it was recontextualized into a broader artistic mission. They didn't just triumph over obscurity, they deliberately walked all over it. Classical composers. Now, the list of dismissed talent is not limited to pop and rock musicians. There are many stories just like these involving classical composers as well. At the age of 18, in 1832, Giuseppe Verdi was rejected by the Milan Conservatory. The reasons cited for this rejection were his age and reportedly inadequate piano technique. He simply wasn't a good enough musician. Now, during his time as a music student, Claude Debussy faced disapproval from faculty, including his composition teacher, for his departure from traditional rules of composition. Franz Schubert's struggles included writing music that exceeded his own performing capabilities, which impacted his ability to promote his own work during his lifetime. In other words, he wrote music that was too hard for himself to play. Many of Gustav Mahler's works, particularly his large-scale orchestral and choral compositions, were controversial upon their initial performances and were slow to gain critical and popular approval. They never really caught on with audiences until after the composer's death. Now, what connects these stories is not merely perseverance, but the sudden appearance of a catalyst. These catalysts do not create talent, but they activate it. Latent talent often remains dormant until it counters just the right producer, the right label, audience, or moment. These artists didn't just wait to be discovered, they endured misrecognition, resisted reshaping themselves to fit prevailing molds, and often had to leave institutional spaces to create new ones. This suggests that our cultural institutions must become better at fostering nonconformity and embracing uncertainty. Rigid standards, narrow aesthetics, and entrenched biases do not merely overlook talent, they actually suppress it. Recognition should not depend on pre-existing categories, but more on openness to new ones. The artists profiled here remind us that genius is not always obvious, polish is not always a virtue, and rejection is not always the end of the story. Rejection, paradoxically, becomes a form of resistance to premature definition. It forces the artist to evolve, to seek new context, and to build alternative pathways. In this sense, rejection is not the absence of recognition. It's the misalignment of moment and medium. In the end, the question is not why these artists were rejected, but how many more remain unrecognized today. That's the question that bugs me. They're waiting for the catalyst to arrive. Thank you, everybody. This has been the Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening. Keep learning.
Keep listening. Keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening. Keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Take a break from your usual routine and tune in to the Tom Daniels Show. You'll discover the world of melodies and stories that you might not know. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.